Good morning, St. John's. This is the second part of our three-part series for Black History Month, looking at the history of racism in our own backyard. And this morning, we're really pleased to have our own Jay Mallin present his presentation on some various techniques and practices of exclusion and oppression in the neighborhoods surrounding St. John's, from business to housing and beyond. So we're really excited to have his presentation and all of these fruits of his own research for us this morning. And so, Jay, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. Happy almost spring. Krista and I were out for a walk yesterday, and in our local park, there are hundreds of crocuses up, and oh, that looks so good. Cannot come too soon. I don't know how the rest of you feel about winter in Washington, but so today I'm talking about the roots of segregation in our neighborhood. And I'm going to be talking about homes, where we live and where other people don't live to some extent. If, like me, you've always lived in a comfortable home in a good neighborhood, you may not have had much occasion to think about it, but the location of your home is really important, at least here in America. Our homes provide a lot more than shelter. Your address determines what schools your kids go to. You probably have thought about that. Access to jobs, the social network that may help you find a job or find your next job, whether you can buy good groceries, fresh groceries, quality of health care, the quality of the policing and other government services you get. And just on the financial side, as far as building wealth, your address is really important. For the middle class, and in America, pretty much all of us consider ourselves middle class. It's the source of wealth, source of financial reserves if you need money, and also the source of intergenerational wealth. If you bought a home near St. John's a generation ago and pass it on to your kids as an asset, that's pretty substantial. So we're going to start. You might want to open your chats. I hope I have a picture up of housing. Maybe there's a commercial establishment right in front. Who can identify this neighborhood for me? Anybody? I'll give you a minute on chat. Where is this? No, not seeing anybody who recognizes this neighborhood. Oh, Swan's taking Adams Morgan and Catherine, and Ginny says Old Georgetown Road. Well, Adams Morgan is certainly closer. This is LaDroit Park. It's if you go south on North Capitol Street, it's a couple blocks off to your right, just before Florida Avenue. LaDroit Park is just the coolest neighborhood. It was founded in 1873 by a businessman named Amzie Barber, and it was DC's first post-Civil War suburb. And it's a really good place to start talking about our neighborhood. The funny thing, Barber had actually served as acting president of Howard University, though not very successfully. But he bought 55 acres of land from Howard, and his plan was to make this neighborhood a whites-only neighborhood, and a fancy one. It was as exclusive a settlement as one might want to imagine, according to one account. The streets broke off from DC's grid and still have their own names. Each house is different, a lot of landscaping and stuff. To keep this neighborhood exclusive, Mr. Barber also built a big wooden fence between his development and the growing neighborhood near Howard University that's kind of north of it or behind it. And some of the LaDroit property owners didn't care for the fence. It was ugly. And the residents of what was then called Howard Town, that is the growing suburb around Howard University, definitely didn't like it. It blocked their walk in the town to jobs and stuff. So this launched years of fence wars, to the delight of our local newspapers, which covered it. And the fence would get torn down and then rebuilt and torn down. And of course, Howard students were involved in this, and I'm sure everybody had a good time. But the fence terror downers, I guess you could say, eventually won, because by World War I, LaDroit Park was almost exclusively Black, though it was still a sought-after address. It was a address for the elite. The reason for this, I put this up sort of as illustration, was that in the late 1800s, despite the racism and despite the legal restrictions, in the 1800s, Blacks had a number of advantages in DC that made it really hard to shut them out of an exclusive address. They had educational opportunities that drew in Black people from other states. They had job opportunities, even white-collar managerial positions with the federal government, thanks to civil service, at least until Woodrow Wilson showed up. And they also had a really strong entrepreneurial tradition that went back to before the Civil War, and by the time LaDroit Park was going in, had created a Black elite and some Black citizens of DC with really significant wealth. So in the latter part of the 1800s, DC is growing, and the idea of an exclusive all-white suburb still appeals. The very good book, Chocolate City, which I would recommend, describes how races and classes were mixed in the DC of the time in a way that we would find unimaginable. You had rich and poor living on the same block. You could have whites living on the street and Blacks with houses right behind them on the alley. So a small group of investors who were also thinking about the great possibilities of mass transit, hatched a plan to build another exclusive neighborhood that they hoped would stay exclusive. And one big difference from LaDroit Park, and then there were other attempts in DC to build all-white suburbs, would be the location of this. So starting in the 1880s, these men started buying farmland down near DuPont Circle, all the way up to Maryland. They were mentioned in newspaper accounts of the time as the California Syndicate, and their investments actually trace back to the holdings of a Nevada senator who had just passed away, a guy named Senator William Sharon. In fact, the California Syndicate was led by Senator Sharon's son-in-law. Okay, here's the next question. Can you name Senator Sharon's son-in-law? And for extra points, can you give the name of the company that they incorporated in Rockville in 1890? Anybody want to give that a shot? Give it another minute. Who was Senator Sharon's son-in-law that headed the syndicate of guys buying land? And I'm assuming it's men. I'm not seeing many guesses. There we go. Way to go, Kathy, our archivist. Senator Sharon's son-in-law was later known as Senator Francis Newlands, and the company that he and his colleagues incorporated in 1890 was the Chevy Chase Land Company. Let me show what this looked like. Here's some real estate coverage from the Washington Star in 1890. A few weeks ago, Mr. Johnny Bell purchased 2 large farms in this vicinity, and he sold one of these, the Belmont Farm, to the California Syndicate. 125 acres, lies partly in Montgomery County and partly in DC. Now, the Belmont Farm adjoins Chevy Chase, which is owned by John C. Bullitt and others. Chevy Chase at this point, this name expands over the next 70 years, refers to the former estate of Mr. Bradley. It's the property across from St. John's. It's the country club. It belonged to a very colorful lawyer named Bradley. Let's see, it is stated the California Syndicate has about completed negotiations for the purchase of this property. So let's take a bigger look at what their little real estate venture looked like. All right, this is a 1894 map. This is a few years later. So Connecticut Avenue has been built. Hopefully you can see the National Zoo is there. And I've highlighted, and you can also see to the left of the zoo and a couple places where Francis Newlands directly owns property. But I've highlighted out the property that the Chevy Chase Land Company owns. Okay, and we're going to just go out what's now and what by then had become Connecticut Avenue, or was the trolley line. All this Chevy Chase Land Company land going right out to Bing. It hits what's now Western Avenue, and that's where they start developing in Maryland. Nothing wrong with the land that they owned in DC. In fact, the land company later developed it. I used to live on it, but they were aiming for Maryland. So, but why did they stop? As you could hopefully make out, there was a lot of farmland. They could have stopped near what's today Cleveland Park or something. And building a trolley line all the way out there was a huge engineering undertaking, quite remarkable at the time. Well, Francis Newlands himself once suggested they made a beeline for Maryland because he thought residents of his new suburb would like to be able to vote, which, you know, in DC was largely denied. Some graduate student working on a thesis said, well, they aimed for Maryland because Francis Newland knew there was a federal law coming that would have made it hard to make curvy streets, and he wanted curvy streets for his new development. But, you know, I'd point out that in crossing the line into Maryland, there's another difference. We've already talked about the position of Black citizens of DC, where there's economic and educational opportunity. But once you crossed into Maryland, you had entered, particularly at Montgomery County, once you crossed into Montgomery County, you had entered the South. So this is the 1880 article from the New York Times. I have to take exception to the headline, a brutal Negro lynched. The New York Times used that exact same headline multiple times. It was their standard. It had nothing to do with journalism or anything. They just threw that on stories about lynchings. But in any case, this was the first of the 3 lynchings in Montgomery County. Y'all know, some of y'all know that I did a documentary on this with a grant from Montgomery County. In fact, I started looking into the properties around St. John's. I just kept getting distracted. I was pulling lynching property records, and I kept pulling stuff from around St. John's. And the fact that there were indeed 3 lynchings here, 2 in 1880, 1 in 1896, and some other attempts along the way, tells you a lot about the situation in our county. You got to remember, lynchings of this sort were not some sort of frontier judicial process where they didn't have a real system. Montgomery County had a perfectly good criminal justice system in 1880 and 1896. Lynchings were racial terror. They were intended to keep Blacks in their place, whether this was in Montgomery, Alabama, or Montgomery County, Maryland. So it was Montgomery County, Maryland, where Francis Newlands, later Senator Newlands, and his partners decided to start putting in their first roads, inventing the trolley suburb. In Montgomery County, nobody was going to be tearing down any walls, either physical walls or metaphorical walls. The developers used covenants, though not yet racial covenants, to help make sure their neighborhood would remain exclusive. These included minimum setbacks, prohibited commercial enterprises, things like that. They also required minimum prices. To buy a home facing Connecticut Avenue, and the trolley line had to cost at least $5,000, and those further in the interior were a few thousand less. Here's from the covering the E.W. Haight subdivision of Norwood Heights. This is our immediate neighbors. You see, the restriction was you only had to price houses at $2,500. And I'm sorry to say that we are in a low rent district of Chevy Chase. Anyway, here's how a Chevy Chase Land Company brochure from some years later, 1916, summarized the restrictions. The only restrictions imposed are those which experience has proven are necessary in any residential section to maintain or increase values and protect property holders against the encroachment of undesirable elements. Now, Senator Newland's views on undesirable elements were very well known, especially once he became a senator. There's Senator Newlands. Here he is giving an interview in 1912 at the Democratic Convention in Baltimore. And he explains, I believe this should be a white man's country. So he's there to propose a constitutional amendment that would have disenfranchised Black voters and would have blocked Asian immigration. His political goal seems to have been to marry the racism of the South with the racism of Western states that were, anti-Chinese and the rest. It was a prescient strategy, but he was a few years early, I guess. Okay, and a few years later on the Senate floor, he called for a constitutional amendment writing the word white into the US Constitution. So let's pause there for a moment. I described how Chevy Chase set minimum prices as part of an attempt to keep the riffraff out. And Senator Newlands was, he would agree, he was a white supremacist and a white nationalist. But the initial covenants in the area did not include racial restrictions that were included later, a little further out in the county. So maybe they just wanted to keep poor people out, right? That's a little less shocking. Well, there was a public test of this in the early 1900s, around 1906. Two archivists named Neil Flanagan and Kimberly Bender dug out the story just in the last couple of years. Here's the story. It's about 1906, and there's another syndicate called the Belmont Syndicate has purchased the land that we now know as Saks Fifth Avenue and the parking lot and down around to that shopping center. I think it has a giant in it and stuff. Just down the street. It turns out that these purchases were made by a straw man, a guy named Sheets, who was white, and done to conceal the real buyers, who were 4 Black professionals from DC, 3 of them with advanced degrees from Howard. Their plan was to open a development in the Maryland suburbs where affluent Black buyers would be welcome. A nice idea. Let's take a look at a newspaper ad. Beautiful Belmont Chevy Chase, the only high-class subdivision in Washington where colored people can buy. Yeah, that pretty much says it. A.L. Satterwhite there, he's one of the 4 men behind the Belmont Syndicate. So this was originally Chevy Chase Land Company land. It came from theirs, and it would have abutted their other holdings. So how did this go over? This is New York Times coverage. Let me see if I can do. The idea has aroused the property owners to a frenzy of fear, and they're holding meetings and delivering speeches to the exclusion of every other occupation or pursuit customary during this heated season. It's alerted to the danger that menaces them in having a Negro colony touching elbows with them and sharing the pretty suburban trolley. The New York Times may have overwritten a bit, but here's coverage from the Washington Times. It's for a comment from Friendship Heights, which is more or less across the street. So a resident says that having colored persons in his immediate neighborhood would mean an impairment of the value of his property and the destruction of the peace and security of his family and the happiness of his home. Wow, that's a lot to lay on your neighbors. What happened? Well, a lot of things happened. Mr. Satterwhite was arrested by the marshal of the town of Somerset for selling real estate without a license. He was acquitted. He hired a lawyer, and the lawyer argued you have the right to sell what you own. But as soon as he acquitted, the marshal arrested him again, this time for selling property on the Sabbath. He got off on that too. I think the historic takeaway from the incident there is, wow, the town of Somerset had a town marshal, and he was evidently a Pharisee. There was a more serious response too. Because the way mortgages and real estate and commercial real estate was handled at the time, The Chevy Chase Land Company and its partners, the real estate and bank and other partners, were able to keep the Belmont Group from handing over clear titles to the buyers who showed up. And this eventually killed the sales, as you can imagine. And the whole thing went into litigation. Belmont was in litigation for the next into the 1920s. And finally, in the 1920s, the Chevy Chase Land Company successfully petitioned the county courts to have the Belmont subdivision stricken from the county land records. All right, so this takes us into the 1920s. I know a lot of this talk is specifically focused on Chevy Chase. That's for two reasons. For us, they're a really good example. They're our neighbors. They were pioneering. You can also tell the story from the perspective of Silver Spring, where they have a perfectly good parallel story going on the same time. Also, at this point, 1920s expansion is the development is expanding as it has continued to our own day. And I think also the definition of Chevy Chase also kept expanding for a number of years. Anyway, 1920s, the idea of putting the suburbs in Maryland has really taken off thanks to the automobile. And this is also the time when racial covenants really took off. The earliest covenants in Montgomery County were probably in Silver Spring, dated around 1904. And it's important to understand, these covenants were not some individual racist homeowner trying to save their house for futurity. The racial covenants were a sales tool. It was real estate developers adding another amenity, as it were, to their house. You get a garage, you get 2 bedrooms, you get a racial covenant if you buy from us. In the past, it's been a real pain to research these things. Like, I once checked the rectory building across the street from us, the really old rectory, and to see what they had, and an entire evening, and what I found out was that it had a covenant that banned the sale and manufacture of hard spirits, no bootlegging in the rectory. However, we got a real gift this past year from the County Historic Preservation Office, which joined up with the Geographic Information System. They have created an interactive map where you can click and see if a particular property or subdivision had a covenant and what that covenant said. It's great. Let me take a look at the map. There it is. Each of those colored shapes shows where there was a covenant. And yes, I'm going to give you a link to this in a little bit. Many of these covenants, especially the original ones, were just straight up nobody of African descent. Here's one from, I think it's called Section 8 of Chevy Chase, 2 blocks north of St. John's on Wall Street. This is pretty standard. That said, land and premises shall never be rented, leased, sold, transferred, or conveyed, lawyers were still into synonyms back then, unto or in trust for or occupied by any Negro or a colored person or any person of Negro extraction. That was pretty straight up. That's 1924, I think on Wall Street. Later on, these got, remember, for the developers, this is an amenity they're promising their buyers, so they got more elaborate. Check this out. This is from Bradley Woods off Wilson Lane, I think right next to Langdon. I can't read all the synonyms, but it's no part of the land, to Negroes or any persons of Negro blood or extraction, or to any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin. And they include in this Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, Syrians, Greeks, and Turks. How about that? And then, of course, don't forget the Mongolian race, Chinese, Japanese, and Mongolians. And that's probably the only countries they could name in Asia. So that was it. One thing this does is give a nice idea of just how narrow the idea of white was at the time. And I'm not doing there are a lot of covenants and restrictions on Jews. I'm not doing that today. It should be like a whole other thing. I will say that in 1947, residents of Bannockburn, some residents of Bannockburn sued one of their neighbors, a Christian lady, trying to get her to force her husband out of the house because he was Jewish. That was in 1947. So I know some people are wondering if your own neighborhood is involved in this. So let me put that in the chat if I can. Oh, can I copy link? Yeah, I think so. Here you go. I have to give a warning though about this. It's not really accurate for individual properties. It tells you about subdivisions. If you really want to know about your own individual property, you have to do the thing tracing back through deeds that takes forever. All right, so I figure people know about racial covenants, and already familiar with redlining. This is the redlining map of Baltimore. The original maps were done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1935 to look at 239 cities and map out where were risky places for mortgages because the federal government had gotten into the mortgage business. On these maps, the good neighborhoods were in green and got an A, like an A1 or an A2. The really bad neighborhoods, which included like all the African-American neighborhoods, were in red and got a D1, whatever. This Baltimore map is pretty good for 1937. Our previous rector, Susan Flanders, married Kristen, me in Baltimore on the grounds of an exclusive private school. And look closely, it's in green under an A1. And if you go to the street corner where Freddie Gray was arrested in 2015, he's in red under a D4. The same county folks doing the useful study about covenants have checked into the home loans. They looked at 409 HOLC loans. 400 of those loans went to white people. 7 of them went to African Americans. Tells you something. We don't have the redlining map, or nobody's found it yet for DC, but this is an HA map, FHA map, successor agency for DC, and the Black neighborhoods got an H, and it writes. You can see what the FHA had to say about that. The FHA in its manual also actually encouraged racial covenants. So when did redlining end? When did it end? You know, you tell me. In 2012, Wells Fargo agreed to pay $175 million to 8 cities because they had intentionally put Black and Hispanic homeowners, charged them more and steered them to worse loans, not based on their credit, but based on their race. The Justice Department estimated this affected 30,000 borrowers. Again, this is in 2012. Okay, well, back to the racial covenants. You know, they're a useful sales tool and were quite popular for a time. The Supreme Court ruled them unenforceable in 1948. Now, it's important to note, the Supreme Court didn't say the racial covenants were illegal. Private parties, developers, homeowners associations were perfectly allowed to follow them. They just said that you couldn't get the courts to step in and enforce them if there was a problem. So that, and let me point out this ad, Evening Star, 1936. This is just up Wisconsin Avenue, like across, I think there's a Marriott there or something. You see it's a restricted subdivision. This is the key words telling people that they might want to consider it because, hey, it's got this extra amenity. So what was the impact of the Supreme Court decision? Well, in our neighborhood, really there wasn't an impact. This is 1952. Oh, where's Glendale Road? I don't remember. But you'll see a highly restricted subdivision in Chevy Chase near transportation, schools, and churches. It made absolutely no difference in advertising whether or not what the 1948 Supreme Court ruling said. Yeah, I think that's worth looking at. So let me see, and also homeowners associations. This is the Chevy Chase Citizens Association in 1962, voting to keep their non-white ban. And actually, evidently, their executive committee had recommended dropping it, and they had what they call non-white members, but the membership at large was not willing to go for that. So the discrimination continues. Those ads with restrictions are actually easier to find, at least when I search, in the 1950s than earlier, 50s and up to like early 60s. And what was the result of all this? This is the result. This is kind of the key takeaway, aside from the Pharisee Marshall, the key takeaway of this. This shows the white and black population of Montgomery County when we started this in 1890, and as of 1960, the black population fell from more than a third to 3%. Is not because black residents were leaving. In fact, next week we get to hear from somebody from Scotland, and there were about 40 significant African-American communities all over the county, really neat and interesting places. That's next week's topic. So the black residents weren't leaving. This change is because white people were pouring in, and only white people were pouring in. In other words, that promise that Montgomery County was the sort of place where you could build an exclusive suburb and keep it exclusive was proving true. So to finish, I want to take a look at, let's see, two families that wanted to move from DC to Montgomery County. Here's a gentleman named Roland Barnes. He has a doctorate from Columbia University in education, and he was hired as principal of the new Travilla Elementary School. That tells you how far the expansion of the suburbs had spread at that time. And his wife, Frances, also had an advanced degree, and they were offered jobs by the Montgomery County school system. Lived in DC, which would be a killer commute. So they, went shopping reasonably for a home, I guess not far from the elementary school. They're eager to do it. They put down a deposit, found a house they liked, they put down a deposit. But when the developer discovered that the Barneses were black, that developer returned their deposit and gave them a letter canceling the contract. Black people, it was simply black people are not allowed to buy here. That Supreme Court decision had nothing to do with it. There's litigation around this. The Barneses initially went to court. I think it reached the Supreme Court, but in the end, the Barneses just moved to Pittsburgh, where they had an interesting career. And as another example, I would like to read a little from hearings before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 1962. They heard testimony from a lady named Mary Williams. She was president of our county branch of the NAACP. Her husband was a dentist, graduate of the esteemed Howard Dental School. Sorry, I was at the home of their dean emeritus this week, so it's esteemed. She says, and I was hired by the Montgomery County Board of Education as a teacher. For 4 years, I traveled. Well, for 2 years, I traveled 66 miles a day. We lived in the district, and I taught in Montgomery County. When my husband graduated from dental school in 1959, we tried to move to Montgomery County. He opened an office in Rockville, in a very undesirable area, but it was the only place available to him. He did eventually move to a better area. So they started with the house in Norbeck Road, which had Black residents. We talked to a real estate developer over the phone, and she quoted the price as it was stated in the newspaper. When she saw that my husband was a Negro, the price went up $1,000. We asked her about this, and she said there'd been a mistake in the newspaper. Now, we had a white friend inquire about the same house. Our friend was discouraged because the sellers felt they had a Negro buyer, and there's a good chance of getting $1,000 more. So there you go. One alternative is, well, we'll sell to Blacks, but we're going to charge them more money. They refused to do that. They weren't going to pay more than was advertised in the paper. So in March of 1961, I called the Suburban Real Estate Agency and told them I'd like to see the house that they've since bought. The agent said he'd like for me to come to the office first. Well, I said that I would rather not, because I knew once he had a chance to see me ahead of time, I would never have the opportunity to buy the house. So she tells him it's inconvenient and she wants to meet at the house. Well, we did this. I got to the house a little ahead of the agent and I went in. And when the agent came to the house, he seemed very surprised to see me. And when the owner introduced us, he said, "You can look around if you want to." And he excused himself from the living room and went into the kitchen, and he asked the owner whether or not he thought I was a Negro. And she gave him some ambiguous answer. He made no attempt to try to sell me the house or interest me in the house. I asked him the price of the house. He said he wasn't sure, but he gave me a price which was $1,000 higher than the asking price. This goes on. It turns out she has the world's least motivated real estate agent. She wants to sign a contract that day. He says, no, well, I have to get in touch with you. So they keep after this guy. And he quotes a really big down payment too, and says, can you handle this? And I said, yes, this would be no problem. The agent said, do you plan to pay cash for your house? And I said, well, of course not. He said, well, you know, you're going to have difficulty financing this house. After he realized I couldn't be discouraged, he said, I understand that you're married to a Negro. And I said that I was. He said, well, personally, I have no objection to you people, but he explained that if he should sell to me, that he would be put out of the Montgomery County Board of Realtors because this was the unethical thing to do. And they have some sort of code that is not proper to change the character of a neighborhood. And when or if an agent should sell to a Negro, this would be changing the character of the neighborhood. This is exactly true. This was part of the National Realtors Code at the time. You couldn't do anything that would adversely affect the character of a neighborhood. In any case, they managed to cut a deal with the owner of the house, leave out the real estate agent so that he doesn't have to risk his career and his business, try to go to settlement. Now the settlement company, you know, all their job is to see you sign the stuff. The settlement company has problems. She finally deals with the settlement companies by saying, I hadn't had an occasion to mention them before that the Justice Department had been very interested in our experiences. So they were able to settle, moved in June 15th, and until July 3rd, things were very pleasant. On July 3rd, a hangman's noose was placed. Oh, let me go to the house. This is Connecticut Avenue. We're talking Kensington. On July 3rd, a hangman's noose was placed on the windshield of my car. And on July 4th, a flaming cross was placed against the wooden beam of the porch. I think that's that wooden thing holding up the roof there. A neighbor from next door came and pushed the cross off the wooden beam because this cross had certainly placed the roof in danger. Well, she said, Negroes are not really affected by crosses and hoods. So this really didn't bother us in any way. This is the cost of a Black family moving to Montgomery County in 1962. You know, the police were there. They said, well, somebody threw a cross, you know, out of their car. She was, no, you got to go up the steps. This was placed up against the house and light this thing. They've had letter from cranks. And one night we left the girls alone and someone called them and told them a bomb had been placed under the house and they should get out immediately. The girls called and told us this had happened and they wanted to know what to do. So we told them to go next door and wait for us. Before they had the chance to leave, the person called again and told them they better hurry and get out. There is a bomb under your house. These have been the only types of annoyances, and I think they are not very important. It goes on to say there are a number of Montgomery County school teachers who do not have suitable or adequate housing. 90%, I believe, of the Negro teachers in Montgomery County live in the district because there are no houses. Well, there were lots of houses. They just weren't allowed to buy there. All right, so let's close with Mrs. Williams. We've come to the 1960s, and there were certainly changes then. There were protests in Bethesda and Silver Spring. Apartment building I can see out my window had protests. Another apartment building that's out there made news by opening to Black residents. And of course, the law has changed in the 1960s so that you could not overtly discriminate the way people had against the Williamses and the Barneses. So the problem solved? Well, I've hit on some of the highlights of how housing segregation was created and enforced in our county, but many other methods continued, and the end of segregation was at best uneven, barely touching many of the most prosperous congregations. So think of the people on your street. St. John's people live all over. Think of the people on your street, or imagine walking from our church to the Apple store. Who do you see? You may not have thought about this much, but in our county, in the last census, the population is only 40% non-Hispanic white. That means if you see 5 people, 3 of them you would expect would be Black, Hispanic, Asian, or one of the 1,500 or so Native Americans that live in Montgomery County. Is that what you get if you look out the door? What's the experience where you work and live today? The story's not over, and I'd like to hear what people have to say. Thank you.
Jay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Will you be taking some questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I asked a question. I'd love to hear questions.
Oh, wonderful. I see Jenny. Go ahead, Jenny.
I live near you. I moved into, I think it's called Rock Creek Forest Annex, which is right, anyone know where Parkway Deli is? We're on the opposite side of East West Highway, behind Temple Shalom. And I did not know the history of Littonsville when I moved in. I wish I had. It would have helped me be more comfortable. But the thing that I learned is that Rock Creek Forest Annex was actually built by a developer specifically for Jewish families because of the issues that they had with housing. And I did not know that. I knew that I bought a home from a Jewish family. I know that most of my neighbors were at the time. When I moved in, the reason it would have helped me to know the history of Littonsville was that I got a lot of blowback from a neighbor because of my son. And they were trying to blame him. He was 9 years old. They were trying to blame him for robberies because obviously he was an undesirable character. And basically, I tried to move as soon as I moved in, but I'm thankful that I stayed because it turned out to be quite a blessing. But it's just interesting to me. I didn't know the history of Rock Creek Forest Annex and how it was founded until last year. So it's really good for you to do these histories because I think it helps us better understand the situation in our neighborhoods.
Thanks. And I just wanted to point out we have a Littonsville resident with us today, Pat Tyson. Thank you for coming. Pat has spoken at these forums and she's agreed to drop in today to visit us. I hope it was interesting. Any other Oh, I think we're getting an unmute. We may get a comment from Pat. Yes,
Uh,
ma'am.
Yeah, good morning, Jay and everyone. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes of it, I hope. But if it's still on tape, I'd like to see the very beginning of it. I believe when, well, my parents, my family, I should say, moved to Littonville 102 years ago. So my father grew up basically here. He was born in Wheaton, and this community more or less was being settled with more families than had been in 1853. And so I can remember, I didn't know anything about Rock Creek Forest, but I can remember when we moved into Silver Spring. I was 4 years old. My parents first, we lived in DC, and then he got injured on his job, and so he came out to live with his family here in Silver Spring until he got settled. But I can remember Rosemary Hills being mostly a Jewish neighborhood, and you could tell that on the different holidays or different occasions. Somehow they decorated their property or what they did. And I didn't think anything of it. But my neighbor, Charlotte Caulfield, says that when the neighborhood was built, it was supposed to be open so that people in our neighborhood could buy there if they wanted to. Now, Litchensville was a segregated neighborhood. There were no covenants here. They were across the bridge or other places, but it never was. It always had one or two white families in it. It never was without a white family. So that was interesting to me as I began to, and I would see the families when we'd go out of the neighborhood. One lived right across the street from where I live on Michigan Avenue. Had big houses, bigger than any of the other houses in the neighborhood. And then one was across from Rosemary Hills Elementary School. There was a white family there. But it was so interesting because when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Talbot Avenue Bridge, the president of the North Woodside community read to us the covenants that kept people of various color, or I think even, I have to look at that, I think even blood pressure was an element to keep people from buying into that neighborhood. So it's interesting the different covenants that were around just to keep people away from other people.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you read that long one, Sarah wouldn't have been able to buy in these neighborhoods. Actually, the family I grew up in would have been restricted to Rosemary Hills and stuff. Yeah. Other comments or questions? What do y'all see out there? Oh, Kathy. Oh, Kathy,
Unmute Kathy.
Sorry. Book that's written about the pandemic will be called You're Still on Mute. I was curious about the rectory you mentioned.
Yeah, it's where we had at least the associate rectors for a while, right across, is it West Avenue? Right across from the
Church, David Ryder's house, the red house on the corner.
Yeah, the Red House. Once
Yeah.
I've been poking back to that, just curious, and I ended up with the restriction on spirits, the anti-bootlegging covenant. They must have known it would be Episcopalians living there, huh?
Must have. We do love our wine.
And whiskey.
And whiskey. Thanks. We also had a rectory at one point on Old Georgetown Road, long ago.
I should check that one because that was probably built within the time period that covenants were being added.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
It would, it would have been in the late 1800s.
Oh, wow. Oh, well, anyway. Okay.
Okay.
Any other comments? I mean, do y'all wonder when you walk around Bethesda, why does it look like this? You know, I think our whole state may be a majority minority state. If not, we're only around 50% non-Hispanic white, and in Montgomery County, that's a clear minority. So why do some places look the way they do and others don't? Y'all got any thoughts, or what are your experiences?
I don't know the why of it, but I did do some looking recently at the the divisions of the county, and we're in the church and one of the park. Chevy Chase and Bethesda are the only districts in all of Maryland, in all of Montgomery County, that are majority white, non-Hispanic white. Everything else is sometimes you can't find a majority, but not primarily non-Hispanic white. And, you know, it's where people came first, I would guess. They put in the covenants at the time that this part of the county was being built out. And it became the expensive part of the county. Later parts of the county, heck, Rockville wasn't fully developed until sometime thereafter. I think it's just part of it is, as places were built, thinking was changing in some places, and the covenants may not have followed in the 70s and the 60s the way they were in the 40s and before, and even the 50s, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I thought when I first moved to DC and we first lived in Bethesda was, well, rich white people clumped together. Then I discovered, you know, that there'd been this very intentional planning, and that the plans of the Chevy Chase Land Company held up really well. Interestingly, you know, Silver Spring, even in the 60s, there's a magazine article on Silver Spring, and a lady says that she likes it because you can walk all over Silver Spring and not see any Black people. Obviously, Silver Spring is, and you know, Pat wouldn't have been able to shop in downtown Silver Spring. Obviously, Silver Spring has changed a lot, but in other places, and I'd argue that there are a lot of reasons, some of them still quite intentional, that there's this, the way you describe it, like just these two blobs, it's sort of the white enclave, and there's reasons that that's held on other than just straight property values and economics.
Mhm.
Still live, I presume, on land that has a racial covenant. When we moved to Rockville / North Bethesda, we learned, I've said this before, so I'll keep it short, that there was a racial covenant well after we moved in, because a local church wanted to put in a senior citizen home that would not discriminate. People of all colors and religion would be welcome. And they discovered that there was a racial covenant, unenforceable for the reasons you mentioned. But they said, we won't go here unless the neighbors are willing to support us. So they sent out a letter to every known person with a mailing address in this particular racial covenant area, including us, and asked, how would you feel about this? And we'd say, well, we feel horrible about the covenant, but we're very happy if you were here. But still, the covenants, I'm sure, still on the books for these properties. They're just not being enforced.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm sorry, Pat. Well,
No,
actually, Langdon raised his hand first. We're going to do it like Bible study, if that's okay. So Langdon raised his hand first, and then Pat's up.
So, sort of an interesting footnote for since a lot of St. John's people are not necessarily from Maryland or Montgomery County. But the whole Newland story, and you pointed out sort of the Western component of racism, and I think your covenant thing gets at some interesting issues. But I'll just say this footnote: people should, if they don't know, that Newlands was a Californian who married into the wealth was Nevada money, Comstock lode, huge silver mine. But he actually developed a suburb, not just Chevy Chase, but Newlands was involved in the development of Burlingame, a early suburb of San Francisco. And I haven't looked into the story of Burlingame much, but I can guess it was it had some pretty interesting and serious racial issues associated with it. And probably the Chinese and Asian element was more in view. But I do think that when you got, the breadth of some of the covenants do get at an interesting thing for us to think about is sort of, the breadth of the breadth of the whiteness. These people had views of whiteness, and their ability to discriminate was pretty broad. And it came up a little bit with Kathy's last week, like we got into mention of the KKK and whatnot, but and then Kathy went on to talk about the extreme anti-popery views of an early rector. But like anti-Catholicism was a part of this extreme Protestant whiteness, and any rate, the breadth of the discrimination was, their worldview was narrow.
Yeah.
Greeks, I grew up with, my best friends in Salt Lake were Greeks, but the covenant clearly shows, well, Greeks aren't any good either,
I'd say their sense of geography sucked. The people who wrote some of those, they're just really way off. Thanks, Landon. Pat, and then Deborah.
Well, I am a member of a senior fitness group in Bethesda, and you get to, the group became very family oriented, and we were very close. But this has been about now 10 or 12 years ago. One of the members there in the Chevy Chase area, her husband passed. So she was selling her house, because it was a big house, and she didn't want to stay there by herself. And so one day I gave her a ride home. She had stopped driving. And I gave her a ride home because she didn't drive that day. And we were talking, and she said to me, my house is up for sale, but 2 of my neighbors bought it. And the reason why is that to keep undesirables from buying the house, or certain people from moving into the neighborhood. And I thought to myself, does she know I'm sitting here taking her home? I'm sure some of the people that they didn't want there were people like me. But
And this is just 12 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was shocked. And I thought, so she said they're buying it, and they will be able to control the sale of the house to who they want to have it.
Yeah, there are other stories like that. Deborah, thank you. That was a good one. Deborah Parker, if you can unmute.
I love that. The reflection of that Kathy said, the reflection of the pandemic years will be that you forgot to unmute. I think that's a great book title. Hilarious. Yeah, I might as well put myself a picture. Hopefully you can see me. I'm multiple working here. So I have 2 things to share. One is just maybe a fun fact, but the other is information sharing. So if anybody's really interested in this topic, there is a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. You're nodding, you read it or you know of it. But he, after writing the book during the Black Lives Matter movement, I watched him on a couple of seminar, LA Lives, a couple of other book author seminars. And he was so passionate about people coming out for that movement. And he was saying that still to this day, if you read the book or you know anything about his concerns, that these things still exist in the country. And so he wanted to create, analogous to the Black Lives Matter movement, these groups, I think they're called red teams, but you can look him up. And if you kind of search around YouTubes and different things, he has had volunteers in states throughout the US that are now, as we speak, looking at covenants and finding the things that are still there, because he realized it's kind of intention, attention, no tension. Like, we can't always be surprised when we learn these things. Like, let's just dig in and find them. And so these groups exist, and they're volunteers that are doing that work. So I thought that was interesting. The second information sharing from his book is that he does report that Montgomery County is held up as an example of one place that tried to put forth effort to correct some of these things in the affordable housing program. I think it's the MPDU program. And it stands up as one model of some effort being done to kind of at least address income disparities. And I believe the program, in fact, was really, I work in property management. So I think the MPDU program was really not so much skewed for racial equality, but it really went to encourage students to be able to have affordable housing in the county, because they found that we have a lot of universities, and they had people that were not able to afford to live near where they worked. So it really was pushed towards them, not towards, anything else. And I can give you more stats on the current system, but I won't. But the second thing that's also interesting and a fun fact is I'm a member of the Junior League of Washington. And we just did a similar project like this about our house that was donated to us. And the house is the Loughborough house, the Loughborough family. You guys that have been here for a long time probably know them. But what they talked about in doing the work that Kathy did last week and you did this week was that many of the Georgetown slave owning families that had property there bought property in Montgomery County, and specifically in the Chevy Chase Bethesda area. So there was definitely a draw of some sort, because when they mentioned it, I thought, oh, that's where I live. And so when you pair that with what you just, offered us to consider, it's kind of interesting because they definitely show that they bought big plots of land and they had their homes there. They kind of left to their children or other people to manage because they wanted to be where they could be in a more exclusive, restricted area. So they moved here from the Georgetown area. And so that's kind of the interesting history of that house that's on M Street, 3039 M Street.
Oh, cool.
That was it.
Cool, thank you. The guy who gave St. John's its land lived right by there too, within a few blocks of there. I think I'd have to look at a map, but really close. Anybody else?
Jay, thank you so much. This has been just really excellent and informative, if a little bit painful. Go ahead.
No, I wanted to put that link because I know people are interested in the covenants. I was going to put that in the, and people will be asking me for this. Send chat to everyone. This is the link to look up covenants in your neighborhood. I just want, if anything, I want folks to understand the covenants are a really visible, easy to point to part of the property record, but they were only seriously around from the 20s to 48. And as I showed both in the advertising and in the experience of Mrs. Williams and the Barnes, that discrimination continued full force right up into the early 1960s. And whether or not there were written covenants, that absolutely continued. Then I hope people have that as a takeaway. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Sorry.
No, thank you so much, Jay. This has been fantastic, and I really appreciate you sharing with us. And I appreciate all of you showing up, and I hope to see a lot of you next week as well, when we'll welcome our friends from Scotland, AME Zion Church over in Potomac, to tell us a little bit about their experience and also how St. John's already is and will continue to be involved. And Patricia, it looks like you have a comment.
I just wanted to add this one last comment. When we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Talbot Avenue Bridge, which connected North Woodside and Lytonsville, the president of the association read to us the covenants, but he also felt the need and the necessity to apologize. Now, he didn't live there. He was a newcomer to the neighborhood, but the neighborhood has changed. The people had changed. The people wanted to build a bridge like the bridge that was there. And so every time I think of it, and it's on film, this gentleman, how he was heartily sorry, apologizing for what had happened in our neighborhood towards because of who we were. And he broke down and cried. So this was from the heart. This was not him just reading or saying something. This was his heart saying, we are sorry that happened. And I think as long as we, as a people on both sides, can forgive and look forward to the future and building in the future, things will work out great. And that's what America is about. She may be wrong in many areas, but there's always that hope and that possibility that things will be right. And they know what's right. Thank you.
Amen.
So much. Amen, indeed. Happy Sunday, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Jay, thank you again. This is fantastic presentation.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. It's wonderful. People want to hear this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. See you all maybe in church, maybe next time. Happy Sunday, everyone.
Oops.